The shells fell like rain from a sky that had forgotten what peace looked like, and the beach at Anzio was churning with explosions that threw sand and blood and broken bodies into the air, and somewhere in that chaos, a young black woman crawled through the mud dragging a wounded soldier behind her because the stretcher-bearers were dead and the medics were overwhelmed. And she was the only one left who could move, and she kept crawling even as the German artillery walked closer and closer to where she was, because stopping meant dying and dying meant abandoning the men who needed her. Her name was Lillian Beatrice Thompson, and she had been born in 1920 in a small town in Georgia where the cotton fields stretched to the horizon, and the laws that governed her life had been written by men who believed she was less than human, and she had grown up knowing that. America did not love her the way it loved its white children, but she had also grown up believing that love was something you gave freely, regardless of whether it was returned. And that belief would carry her across an ocean to a war that would test everything she thought she knew about courage and sacrifice. She had wanted to be a nurse since she was 8 years old, when her grandmother died of a fever that a white doctor refused to treat, because he did not attend to colored patients, and Lillian had sat beside the bed holding her grandmother's hand, and watching her slip away, and she had sworn that she would become the kind of healer who did not turn anyone away, and that promise drove her through years of study and struggle and discrimination until she finally earned her nursing certificate from a segregated training program that white hospitals would not recognize. But what happened next changed everything. Because when the war came, the Army Nurse Corps began accepting black women for the first time in American history. And Lillian was among the first to volunteer, and she endured the skepticism of officers who did not believe that black nurses could meet military standards. And she proved them wrong with every exam she passed and every patient she treated. And she was assigned to a hospital unit that would support the Allied invasion of Italy in one of the bloodiest campaigns of the European War. The voyage across the Atlantic took 17 days, and Lillian spent most of it below decks in quarters that were segregated from the white nurses, and she did not complain, because complaining changed nothing, and she used the time to study medical procedures and to prepare herself mentally for what she would face. And the other black nurses became her sisters in those cramped quarters, and they supported each other through seasickness and fear and the knowledge that they were sailing towards something none of them could truly imagine. They landed in North Africa first and worked in field hospitals, where the wounded poured in from the fighting in Tunisia, and Lillian learned quickly that war did not care about the color of skin, because blood was always red and screaming was always the same language, and the soldiers who lay on her operating tables grabbed her, and, without seeing her race, they only saw someone who might save their lives, and she saved as many as she could, and mourned the ones she lost, and kept working through exhaustion that felt like drowning. Yet she never imagined this moment would reshape her destiny, because in January 1944, her unit received orders to support Operation Shingle, the amphibious landing at Anzio that was supposed to break the stalemate in Italy and outflank the German defensive lines, and Lillian boarded a transport ship with 40 other nurses, and they sailed through waters patrolled by German submarines toward a beach that would become one of the most contested pieces of ground in the entire war. The landing, on January 22nd, was initially unopposed, and there was a brief moment of hope that the operation might succeed quickly, but the Allied commanders hesitated to push inland. And that hesitation gave the Germans time to reinforce their positions, and within days the beachhead had become a trap with American and British forces, surrounded on 3 sides by enemy artillery, and the hospital tents that Lillian worked in were within range of guns that fired day and night without mercy. And then something no one expected, because on the morning of February 7th, the German artillery barrage scored a direct hit on the field hospital where Lillian was treating patients, and the explosion tore through the canvas walls and killed 17 people instantly, including 3 nurses who had been standing next to her, and Lillian was thrown across the tent, and when she regained consciousness, she found herself half buried in debris, with blood running from a wound on her head and the screams of the wounded filling her ears. She pulled herself from the wreckage and began treating survivors, even though her own injuries needed attention, because the patients came first. They always came first, and she worked for 6 hours straight before she allowed anyone to look at her wounds, and by then the cut on her head had become infected, and the shrapnel in her left arm had torn through muscle, and the doctors told her she needed to be evacuated. But she refused because there were not enough nurses, and leaving meant abandoning her patients. Behind these ruins, a secret waited. Because as Lillian continued to work through the siege of Anzio, she began to notice that the German artillery seemed to know exactly where the medical facilities were located, and the attacks were too precise to be random, and she mentioned this to one of the doctors, and he told her to keep quiet because there were rumors of spies in the area, and no one knew who could be trusted, and Lillian kept her suspicions to herself. But she started paying attention to who came and went from the hospital. The conditions at Anzio were unlike anything the nurses had trained for, because the beach was so small that there was no safe rear area, and the hospital tents were as vulnerable as the front lines, and Lillian learned to keep working during bombardments, because stopping meant patients would die, and she developed a kind of calm that amazed the soldiers, who watched her, because she never flinched when the shells landed close, and she never cried when a man died under her hands, and they did not know that she saved her tears. For the darkness of her tent at night, what she discovered next would shake even her commanders, because during a lull in the fighting, Lillian was treating a wounded German prisoner who had been brought in from a reconnaissance patrol, and as she cleaned it, the wound on his leg, he began to speak in English, and he told her that he had been born in Chicago and had moved to Germany with his parents when he was 12 and had been drafted into the Wehrmacht, and he wept as he told her that he had never wanted to fight against his own country, and Lillian held his hand and listened and realized that the enemy was not always what it seemed. The American soldier, named Thomas, who guarded the prisoner, watched this exchange with eyes that held questions he would not ask, and Lillian saw something in his expression that she recognized because he was a black man from Mississippi, who had grown up under the same laws that had shaped her life, and they began to talk during quiet moments. And they discovered that they had both come to this war looking for something more than victory, and that something was proof that they belonged to a country that would never fully accept them. March brought rain that turned the beachhead into a sea of mud, and the wounded kept coming, and the supplies kept running low, and Lillian improvised with whatever she could find, and she reused bandages that should have been thrown away, and she diluted medications to make them stretch further, and she watched young men die from infections that could have been prevented. If only there had been enough penicillin, and each death felt like a personal failure, even though she knew she had done everything possible. The German prisoner, whose name was Friedrich, recovered enough to be transferred to a POW camp in the rear, and before he left he gave Lillian a small, carved wooden cross that he had made from a piece of shrapnel casing, and he told her that she was the kindest person he had met in the war and that he would pray for her survival, and she took the cross and tucked it into her pocket, and she carried it for the rest of her life, as a reminder that humanity could survive even in the midst of madness. And then something no one expected, because on the night of March 15th, the Germans launched a massive counterattack designed to push the Allies back into the sea, and the hospital was directly in the path of the assault, and Lillian and the other nurses were ordered to evacuate, but there were patients who could not be moved, and Lillian refused to leave them, and she stayed behind with a skeleton crew of medics while the sound of gunfire grew closer and closer. The German soldiers who burst into the hospital were expecting to find American infantry, but instead they found wounded men on cots and a handful of medical personnel with their hands raised, and Lillian stood in front of her patients with her Red Cross armband clearly visible, and she spoke to the German officer in the only German words she knew, which were please and help, and the officer looked at her with an expression she could not read, and then he ordered his men to leave the hospital untouched, and they withdrew as quickly as they had come. The siege of Anzio finally ended in May, when the Allies broke out of the beachhead and linked up with forces advancing from the south. And Lillian walked through the ruins of what had been the hospital and counted the graves of colleagues who had not survived, and she felt a numbness that went deeper than exhaustion, because she had used up every emotion during those 4 months, and there was nothing left inside her but a hollow space where fear and hope had once lived. But the war was not over, and Lillian continued to serve through the liberation of Rome and the long bloody advance up the Italian peninsula, and she treated soldiers from every unit and every background, and she saw the best and worst of humanity in those months, and she learned that courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision to keep moving despite it, and she moved forward day after day, because that was all she knew how to do. The soldier named Thomas was killed in August during the fighting near Florence, and Lillian learned of his death from a chaplain who brought her his dog tags and asked if she would write to his family, and she wrote a letter that took her 3 days to complete, because she wanted to find the right words to describe who he had been and what he had meant to her, and she never received a reply, and she never knew if the letter had reached its destination. Victory in Europe came in May 1945, and Lillian stood in a crowd of soldiers in Rome and listened to the announcement, and watched young men weep with relief, and she felt nothing at all, because too many people she loved were not there to celebrate. and the joy around her seemed to belong to a world she could no longer access, and she went back to her quarters and sat alone in the darkness. I wondered who she would be now that the war was over. She returned to America on a transport ship that was just as segregated as the one that had carried her to war and the white nurses were, celebrated with parades and medals while the black nurses were told to use separate facilities and enter through rear doors, and Lillian felt a bitterness rising in her chest that threatened to consume everything she had accomplished, and she had to make a choice about what kind of person she would be in this country that had used her courage without honoring it. She chose to keep fighting, but her battlefield shifted from European hospitals to American courtrooms and city councils, and she became an advocate for civil rights and healthcare access, and she spoke at churches and community centers and anywhere people would listen. And she told them that she had crossed an ocean to fight for freedom, and she was not going to stop fighting just because the enemy wore different clothes. The years turned into decades, and Lillian watched her country slowly change, and she marched with Dr. King, and she voted when the laws finally allowed it, and she trained a generation of nurses who looked like her and who would not have to face the barriers she had faced, and she never forgot Anzio and the friends she had lost there. And every year on the anniversary of the landing, she lit a candle and said their names aloud. She was finally recognized for her service in 1996, when the Army belatedly awarded medals to black nurses who had served in World War II, and Lillian accepted the honor with grace, but she told the general who pinned the medal on her chest that she had not done it for recognition. She had done it because it was right, and because every wounded soldier deserved the same care regardless of the color of their skin or the uniform they wore. Lillian Beatrice Thompson passed away in 2008 at the age of 88. Funeral was attended by nurses and veterans and civil rights leaders and ordinary people who had heard her story and wanted to pay their respects, and the minister who spoke at her service said that she had shown the world what true patriotism looked like, and that her legacy would live on in everyone who chose service over self and compassion over hatred. The beach at Anzio is peaceful now, and tourists walk along the sand where soldiers once died, and the water that runs red with blood and old photographs sparkles blue under the Italian sun, and if you visit the American cemetery nearby, you can find the graves of nurses who gave their lives, and you can try to imagine what it was like to be there in those terrible months. But you will never fully understand because you were not there and they were, and that difference is sacred. Her story reminds us that the greatest generation included people whose names were never written in the history books and whose contributions were minimized or ignored. And Lillian Thompson was one of thousands of black women who served during World War II and who came home to a country that did not honor their sacrifice, and her emergence from obscurity is a reminder that history is never complete and that we must keep searching for the stories that have been hidden. The wooden cross that Friedrich gave her was passed down to her granddaughter, who keeps it in a glass case beside Lillian's medals and her nursing certificate and her photographs from the war and visitors to the family home. Sometimes ask about the cross and they hear the story of how a black woman from Georgia and a German prisoner found a moment of humanity in the middle of hell, and that story is as important as any battle or any victory. And so we remember Lillian Beatrice Thompson, not as a victim of racism or a casualty of war, but as a victor over everything that tried to diminish her, and we remember her not because she sought glory, but because she sought only to heal, and in healing, she proved that love is stronger than hate, and courage is stronger than fear, and that one person with a caring heart can change the world one patient at a time. The shells no longer fall on Anzio, and the screams have faded into silence, and the mud has long since dried into solid ground, but the spirit of Lillian Thompson remains in that place and in every hospital where nurses work through impossible conditions, and in every moment when someone chooses compassion over convenience, and she will remain as long as there are people who believe that every life is worth saving. She crawled through the mud at Anzio, dragging wounded soldiers to safety, and she crawled through the mud of American racism, fighting for recognition, and she never stopped crawling forward, because forward was the only direction she knew, and her journey from a cotton field in Georgia to a battlefield in Italy to a medal ceremony in Washington is the American story in its fullest and most honest form, and we are all better for having shared in it.